Good morning. Ooh, whoa. I did not expect that noise to come through that loud. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to attend this session. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge my First Nations aunties, uncles and brothers and sisters in the room here today. My name's Stacey. I'm CEO of Aboriginal Community Housing Limited, and I am here to facilitate this session today with Skye, Zach, Nat and Aaron, and you can see where they come from up on the screen there. We're here to talk about Aboriginal mobility. And some people ask the question of, well, what do you mean by mobility? And it's really interesting in what context you put that in, because if you're talking with someone from, say, the disability services sector, it usually relates to being mobile, being active, and what that can look like. And if you talk to someone who, say, is an athlete, they look at that a lot different as well. When we talk of it in an Aboriginal context and we talk about Aboriginal mobility, we're talking more about choice and what that looks like for us as Aboriginal people. So the choice or choosing to be able to be involved in decision-making practices, having a say for ourselves and giving us a voice in being able to make, I suppose, decisions around what we want as Aboriginal people for our communities and for ourselves as individuals. I'm going to pass it over to Skye from Aboriginal Housing NT to do her first presentation, and then we'll go down the line after that.
Thanks, Stace. So good morning, everyone. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the Kaurna people on the lands we meet today. I want to sincerely thank Auntie Rosalind for her warm welcome to country yesterday, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name's Skye Thompson. I'm a proud Arunda Kadich woman from Alice Springs. I want to extend the acknowledgement to my people. I've been privileged to live in Larrakia land for the past 2 years, and I also want to acknowledge the Larrakia people that have welcomed me and my family to their land. I also want to acknowledge our Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters. I'm primarily talking to Aboriginal people as the NT consists of that cohort. Here we go. Okay, so Aboriginal Housing, also known as AHANT, is the peak body for Aboriginal housing in the Northern Territory. We represent and support the interest of our 16 members who deliver housing or related services, and we have 5 associate members. We advocate for more funding and better policies that include new housing, better housing fit for culture and climate. For Aboriginal people, cultural mobility is more than moving physically. It's about being able to preserve our cultural identity, traditions and connections. Aboriginal people and communities have ties to ancestral lands, sacred sites, cultural practices that can span many geographical regions. Despite many policies that have tried to sever these connections and force mobility into places we don't call home, there has been many remarkable persistence for mobility that maintains relationship, mutual obligation and connections to the land. Kinship and social connections, blood ties, marriage defines Aboriginal kinship and are a part of a system of relationship that binds us. Cultural responsibilities and ceremonies, connections to the land, songlines and language. Teaching our young people, they learn about culture, places, people, history, the characteristics of plants, animal species by moving through the landscapes. With elders learning and instructing, observing and participating. Other drivers of mobility include sporting events, recreation, hunting, health reasons, sorry business, accessing services, transport, the cost of living. Kinship, interdependency, group unity and community loyalty are the key strengths of our family and community life, and the need to be central to the solutions of homelessness. So this is a bit of NT policy context. So the legacy of colonisation, protection laws and the NT intervention have elevated economic viability over Aboriginal people's rights to mobility. Government policy is framed around stable non-Indigenous populations, and they are inevitably troubled by populations that are mobile. They are harder to monitor, harder to govern, and above all, harder to control. Government policy has displaced Aboriginal people, often forcing people to decide between access to housing or family and culture. This is why we see that external factors drive mobility outside of homelands, remote communities, and these include the need to access healthcare, aged care, NDIS, education and employment opportunities. I use the example of homelands where the effects of policies are very obvious. Homelands are located on Aboriginal traditional lands with cultural and spiritual significance to Aboriginal people who live there. In the 70s, the government began to support people to live on their homelands through small establishment grants. Going way forward, in 2015, the Australian government handed over complete responsibility to the Northern Territory government with a cash payment of $155 million. This funding was insufficient to properly fund homelands and the growth of families. The message was clear from Aboriginal people: by funneling funds away from homelands into communities and other townships, the only way to get proper housing and access to services would be to move away and stay in the large towns and communities. Governments have committed funding to build new houses on 73 communities, but none of them are assigned to homelands. By trying to keep Aboriginal people in one centralised place, this policy failed to recognise the importance of country, cultural practice and homelands across our communities. Despite this, Aboriginal people have persisted in remaining on their homelands with a high degree of mobility. Approximately $40 million a year is allocated to municipal and essential services and repairs and maintenance from the Northern Territory government to recognise existing homelands. New housing has not been a part of this policy. What hasn't quite caught up is the funding and service delivery. Service providers for homelands are having to use small amounts of funding received by the Northern Territory government to put in aids such as ramps, handrails, to help elderly people with disabilities living on homelands. NDIS isn't easily accessible for our people. We are starting to see a shift with the Australian government providing an additional $40 million a year for the next 3 years. However, again, no new houses are included. It is likely, with the continued advocacy, we may see new houses being included after the first 3 years. However, we still see people having to leave their communities and homelands to be able to access services such as renal dialysis, NDIS. This will take far more to resolve. When there are high levels of mobility, there is a need for housing that will allow for mobility and culture to be supported. Design needs to be considered appropriate housing, sizes and options. So designs should include well-designed wet areas and external living options, large and well-screened veranda spaces, adequate sized living spaces, more toilets and showers to allow for outside sleeping, consideration for alternative energy sources, maximising passive heating and cooling, and appropriate sized rainwater tanks, and that comes from a research from Long and Memmott in 2007. If we build houses fit for culture, we build houses that can accommodate big families. These design features allow for the movement of relatives that will not put too much pressure on the house hardware. Design can be supported by Aboriginal people with practice, non-negotiable cultural obligations without the risk of losing their house and becoming homeless. It also avoids family members having to choose between homelessness, public housing that's far from their elders and kinship. There is a need to improve the way we think about social housing sector, responding to Aboriginal mobility, and rethink the way we talk about overcrowding, and this can be done through better understanding of service populations and mobility patterns, the availability of short-term accommodation in regional centres or communities when required, tenancy sustainability for residents, changes to restrictive tenancy rules that facilitate penalties and evictions. It goes against Aboriginal culture to turn away family who need house, which can lead to overcrowding. We need to rethink social housing tenancy rules to accommodate for cultural obligations. So in conclusion, mobility is a cultural right. Aboriginal people need to have a say on their housing needs. There needs to be a genuine, people-centred, place-based approach. Our vision from our founding members is Aboriginal housing in Aboriginal hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Skye, for that. And I forgot a very important part that my speaking notes tell me that I didn't speak to, so apologies. From a housekeeping perspective, if we can just hold questions to the end. And we've got I'm sure you've heard that over the last couple of days, but I was very clearly told that I have to reiterate that. So that would be very much appreciated in that regard. Thank you so much for that, Skye, and I'm sure we're going to get a few questions. Not to stress you out anymore, sis, you did an amazing job. The next person we've got coming up is Aaron from the South Australian Housing Trust now, to talk about some of his experiences within South Australia in relation to Aboriginal mobility.
How are you? So, sorry, the light's a bit funny here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Aaron Ken, and I work here in Adelaide for the South Australian Housing Trust, here and out referred to as just the Trust. I'm a Pindara man from the APY lands, so for those that don't know, that's located in the far left-hand corner of South Australia, right on the tri-state corner. As a visitor here, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of the Adelaide Plains, the Kaurna people. For countless generations, Aboriginal people across Australia had developed complex customs and cultural practices to care for the land and waters that we all benefit from today, and I feel privileged to live and work here on their country. I feel like it's a trapdoor, I'm about to fall through the floor. So this morning, I want to share with you my journey within the Trust. While it's not specifically about homelessness and mobility, it's going to be peppered in there. It's also a bit about Aboriginal-led practice and other topics, but I hope some of the grounded approaches we took can be adapted to your work. During the pandemic in 2020, the APY lands closed their borders to protect the community from COVID. This left a large contingent of Anangal stranded in Adelaide, Anangal being people from the APY lands or the Central Desert region, overcrowding family members, tenancies, or living in the parklands. Despite the strict isolation guidelines, many people were moving between tenancies or from the parkland to tenancies, which heightened the risk of infection among our tenants. We found that, surprise, surprise, that the familial obligations trumped the health concerns and also our lease agreements. To address this, departments and non-government agencies worked together to utilise a nearby campsite, providing a safe space away from the city. One key lesson from this initiative was that, the effectiveness of utilising Aboriginal people from the same language group and cultural group as the group that you're trying to work with. This approach yielded positive results. Following this experience, my colleague and I were brought into the Trust to work specifically with our people, as the Trust had long struggled with the language and cultural barriers faced by Anangal. I would like to highlight that most of the organisations, generally speaking, would have a target regarding hiring a percentage of staff who identify as Aboriginal. And what can happen is they would generally be expected to deliver the role that they've been hired for, but then also, be lumped with more expectations on, speaking on all things regarding Aboriginal matters. And if a client comes in, that's on them as well. What the Trust did was slightly different. We were brought on solely to work with the APY lands people living in housing trust properties in Metro Adelaide. And this was based on our family connection to the tenants and our language and cultural skills. So all of the tenants I work with, I'm actually connected to through family, which comes with its risk, but at the same time, I think there's also familiarity and a comfort level. Eventually, our clientele was extended out to the other neighbouring Central Western Desert language groups. To add to my previous point, Aboriginal workers with cultural skills often become overburdened, expected to act as an interpreter or handling issues beyond their scope. Lorraine and I aim to change this by establishing clear boundaries and protecting our roles from becoming overextended. Initially, this was met with resistance, but with the support of a forward-thinking manager who recognised the need for change, we were able to take charge. Our first task was to redefine the role traditionally known as a tenancy practitioner, a title that didn't fully capture the work we needed to do. We created a new role in a program called Wali Wirral, which in my language roughly translates to good homes. It was a more aspirational and positive approach. Originally we were called complex Aboriginal tenancies, and I wanted to change that as soon as I could. We also restructured our operations to be more proactive, visiting tenancies regularly to build relationships and address issues early on. Because what was happening is we would get called in after there's been issues, and at that point it was generally too late. We recognise that there are up to 8 different regional offices in Adelaide Metro alone, and whilst we aim to have a consistent service across the board, the cultural proficiency of our frontline staff members can vary wildly. This created inconsistent messaging and expectations for our Anangal clients, or tenants, which led to them being confused and, more often than not, issues arising at their tenancies and potentially impacting their tenure. To address this, now I've lost my where I am. To address this, we established our own regional office with a dedicated team. This allows us to manage the leases, the rent, the compliance and complaints in a way that considers our community's unique needs. We're also developing our own policies and procedures with Aboriginal people in mind, aiming to create a better end user experience and hoping these practices can be adopted more widely across the trust. With our client interactions, we spend time having cultural negotiations with our tenants on the main differences of living in the city compared to living in their community, because they're moving between back and forth, and the expectations on the lands and housing are wildly different to living in the city. Because on the lands, you're living next to your kin. In the city, you're living next to people from, all around the world. So we know the main pain points that affect all of our tenancies: property condition, overcrowding and antisocial behaviours. But utilising the Anangal concept of nyapati, which is the cultural practices of reciprocity and exchange underlying the behaviours and actions of all of our tenants. So basically you give a little and I also give a little. So we let our tenants know that they are allowed to have the following expectations of the trust, such as timely maintenance and fair service. But in return, I also expect, or the housing, the trust expects them to uphold their rent and be able to manage the issues in their property. I know there are cultural considerations, and Skye touched on them as well, and behaviours, and sometimes the behaviours are not in their control at times. But I think it's unhelpful in the long run to remove or ignore our services expectations of our clients. It creates an unfair exchange and a bad precedent moving forward, where we do things for them, not with them. Our aim is to create generational change. We want to see our people's outcomes improve. I know I've strayed somewhat from the session topic of cultural mobility, but after listening to what others spoke about yesterday, I rewrote my speech last night and this morning to speak about what was on my heart. I have so much more I could talk about regarding our program and everything we've done at housing or the trust, but I'll leave it there. In the 4 years since Wali Wirral was established, we've grown significantly. We've had not a lot of evictions. We've had not a lot of people failing their tenancies. We've also been able to lift the standards amongst our tenancies, and I think we're growing every year. So we couldn't have achieved this without the Trust's executives and management supporting us, and they've definitely backed us the whole way through. Finally, I encourage you to embrace discomfort and try new things, support your Aboriginal workers and their ideas, even if you don't fully understand them, adapt and integrate cultural wisdom into the modern systems to create lasting positive change. You might be surprised by the results. Thank you.
I always have to move this mic because I'm generally the shortest person in the room. Thank you, Aaron, so much for that. And I think noting after yesterday, particularly in the homelessness session with Neil and Paul and Daniel and Del, and then hearing that you amended what you were going to speak to, I actually think they complement each other. This session and yesterday's session complements each other quite well. I will put you on notice, though. I will be asking you a question about the response to the pandemic with the group, in which we spoke at length about last week. So just to keep that one under your hat for question time. Coming up now, we have Nat Cook. Where did that come from? Wasn't she the Minister for Housing in South Australia at one point? Sorry. Apologies. Nat Clark from Homes New South Wales to talk to us about the mobility project that you guys did. Yeah, thanks, Nat.
That's okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me here today. My name's Natalie Clark. I work in Housing Statewide Services for Homes New South Wales, and we're very operational. Our branch manages the policies, processes and systems that enable our frontline staff to deliver services across the state. So I'm not in the built environment side of things, but there's a very important connection between the client service delivery and the operations that we deliver and the built environment. Under Closing the Gap Target 9A, my team led on a project called the Mobility. It was understanding mobility as a key driver of overcrowding and other housing issues, which was a Closing the Gap initiative that we co-designed with Aboriginal stakeholders, peak organisations and other agencies across the state, to better understand and support mobility for Aboriginal people in relation to the New South Wales social housing sector. So when we were sort of, looking at putting this project together, we did a lot of consultation across the other states and territories, and we realised that mobility is a common cultural need and requirement, but it's so different. It's so different between the different states and the mobility patterns. But then it's also really different, even in New South Wales, between the different locations and areas in New South Wales. So we had quite a bit of work to do looking, at what the mobility needs and patterns and loops were between those different regions across New South Wales, and how our policies and processes and the way that we deliver services might not have been supporting that mobility, and how we could better support that. So the project, we ended up consulting with 9 local communities from sort of different areas. We had remote locations and we had metro locations and we had, I guess, those urban locations as well. And the final report came through with a whole lot of different recommendations on the client service delivery side, and then also in the built environment side. So I'm working on those client service delivery recommendations, and I'm very proud to say that our project team is 100% Aboriginal staff who are working to implement these recommendations, which is fantastic, and we're consulting as we go through locally with relevant Aboriginal stakeholders at that local level, but then also at the state level as well. So I guess some of the findings that came out of the report, it was a pretty long report, so I won't go through all of them because we've got, a bit more to get through today. But I guess, and geez, I wish I could borrow your presentation, Skye, because it was singing to me. It was fantastic. So I think, culture is not going to change. It's just not. So that cultural mobility and that the need for, for that mobility is always going to be there, and the system needs to fit in with the clients that it aims to support. So we need to look at a client-centred approach where we're not trying to fit people in policy boxes. Rather, we're trying to see what can we bring together across the system to be able to support what a person, individual, family or community needs. Mobility contributes so much to well-being as well. We found that there was forced mobility as well as unforced mobility. So when we're talking about forced mobility, these are things like, needing to travel from a remote location to access medical services such as dialysis or to have a baby. There's also, if someone is imprisoned, and then there's that mobility for family members who go to provide support as well to family members who may be imprisoned or who may be receiving medical services, as opposed, I guess, to that unforced mobility, which is where the choice comes in, and you can choose, where and when to go. Also that we need to be able to support people who have, got those cultural obligations and the expectations from family as well, that can sometimes lead to overcrowding and couch surfing, etc. And that there are also impacts, when a person travels from somewhere, there are impacts in that location that they've travelled from. If a property is left vacant, there are impacts there, rental arrears, etc., potentially. And then on the other end, as we know, there is overcrowding, there's additional stress on the community infrastructure, etc. When you've got more people constantly going somewhere for medical services, as example, that's one of the loops that we've got in New South Wales. There needs to be an holistic approach as well. We're not going to solve it just from one agency, which is why we're working so hard on strategic partnerships and partnering with the right agencies to be able to support mobility. And I think, and that coordination as well. So someone's not dealing with 6 different people from 6 different agencies. We should be able to come together and coordinate that to make that a lot easier. So we have made a number of changes. One is we've changed our absence from a dwelling policy so that we can offer $5 rent to Aboriginal people travelling from remote locations to access medical services, because there's the cost of living, but there's also a financial impact on having to being forced to travel with that forced mobility as well. The Best Fit pilot, which we're trialling in Campbelltown, which is about right-sizing the housing portfolio, so reducing under-occupancy. We're just looking at properties, under-occupied properties, where the tenants have initiated a transfer, so they want to move, and how we can reduce that under-occupancy so that we can then reduce overcrowding. And then, I think in the last session they were talking about the undersupply of housing. This is about trying to do the best we can with what we've got and getting creative so that we can free up houses and we can free up spaces. But then during the course of that work, we're also taking into consideration the mobility needs of the tenants there as well. We're reviewing all of our memorandums of understanding so that we can better support our shared clients. And then learning from local decision-making agreements, how can we improve the services that we provide to our Aboriginal clients to better support mobility. And we're also working really hard on our strategic partnerships. One of them in particular is with corrective services and looking at programs that they have to support mobility and how we can work together to be able to support that in a coordinated way for our shared clients. And I think that's me.
Thanks for that, Nat. And again, I think you might get a couple of questions maybe around implementation or kind of what it looks like on the ground, particularly noting that 100% of your team is Aboriginal and seeing how they implement in that respect. So we've heard from 3 different states in relation to Aboriginal mobility and how it can look and from a cultural perspective and from an in practice perspective. Now we're going to hear from Zach from the National Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Housing Association, or NATSIHA as we like to refer to them as. And Zach's going to kind of bring it in for us from like a national perspective and sum it up, and then we're going to open it up to everybody to ask many a question of the panel.
Look, thank you. And just before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the Kaurna people and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. As is customary, culturally, an exchange of information or a bit about myself and where I'm from. So my name's Matysek. I'm the acting CEO of NATSIHA, as mentioned, but from the Meriam Nation of Zenat-Kes, or the Torres Strait, specifically the Meriam and Sumsep tribes, two little islands in the eastern part of the Torres Strait, which is where I've had the privilege to grow up. A bit about the Torres Strait itself, because I often travel to places and people are like, where's that? Is that in PNG or is that in Indonesia? No, it's a part of Queensland, which is in Australia. We're a little group of islands, a couple hundred islands, spread across 48,000 square kilometres of sea country, or the Blue Water Highway, which I like to call it. But now I'm currently residing in Cairns, or which we like to say in Australia, in the Torres Strait, the biggest island in the Torres Strait, Australia. But look, in terms of what I want to talk about today, I think just wrapping it up, I guess, from a national perspective, like each time we speak about the realities of what we face in our communities, the solution is always made clear. It's self-determination through an Indigenous-led and owned model. That's always the answer, regardless of which topic we speak of in terms of our affairs. And the reality is the ongoing homelessness crisis among our people is one that is deeply rooted and entrenched in decades of systemic inequality and policy failures. So we know to effectively address these issues, these disparities, it's imperative to have Indigenous-specific, Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned initiatives, such as in the absence of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-specific national housing and homelessness plan, one that is led from community and ratified through all governments. We continue to be disproportionately affected by homelessness, representing 29% of all people accessing homelessness services in the 22-23 year. Yet we only represent 3.2% of the entire population. That statistic for itself speaks to the gravity of what we're dealing with and speaks to the reason why we need an Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned approach. Furthermore, we know these statistics underrepresent the true figures of what we're dealing with throughout Australia and our communities. It's important to always note, prior to colonisation, we were here for 65,000 years, governing our own affairs through our own systems and structures. Our leadership, grounded in cultural insights and connection, is essential to creating effective and long-lasting solutions, and that will that will be the solution to housing and homelessness challenges. We must also look around what our obligations are in the international space and look at what we've already committed to domestically in Australia. So the adoption of international covenants and declarations into domestic legislation is also a critical part of ensuring all Australians have access to and their basic human rights met, including the right to housing. In particular, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the Convention of the Rights of the Child. As a party to these treaties, Australia is under international legal and moral obligations to promote and to realise the human rights of all people, moreover, the rights and interests of our most vulnerable. We know homelessness is more than just a housing issue, it's a human rights issue. People experiencing homelessness are not merely objects of charity. We're not merely seeking help and compassion. Like all Australians, they are individuals entitled to the protection and promotion of their human rights. In addition to that, the International Declaration, or the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, is something that we should be, or Australia should be, ratifying through domestic law, which speaks specifically to the rights and interests of Indigenous peoples' right to own their affairs and to run their affairs and govern their affairs through their own institutions. Again, it is quite clear, an Indigenous-owned and led system is the only solution. The current bureaucratic layers, administrative inefficiencies and systems of government through their models has and continues to result in significant portions of funds being absorbed through agencies across all levels of government. What that means practically is the money isn't reaching the ground where it's needed. This inefficiency is just simply unacceptable, and it has to be addressed through, again, a distinct Indigenous-led funding model which ensures resources are reaching the ground where they're needed and are in control of their hands that should be leading their own affairs. There's a professor in the Australian National University that often uses the statistics 30 cents to the dollar reaching the ground when it's delivered through a system of government, and one which I would agree, having spent most of my career in state and Commonwealth government delivering housing services. So not only will you be getting more bang for buck, more public value delivering it through our systems, because we know a community-controlled way of delivery costs far less than that of a government-led system. You're actually going to be getting a more culturally responsible way of doing business, On top of that, because we want to see these things through and grow our communities, you're going to be building industry in the process, sustainable industries. But for that to happen, we need long-term, secure funding for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing and homelessness. The funding must be legislated, protected by bipartisan support, and be sufficient enough to address the chronic underfunding that has plagued our communities for decades. Stability for funding is key to provide lasting solutions. Funding that is not only at the whim of government, but is secure and Indigenous-led. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Zach. And again, I think that came out very strongly yesterday and in today's session. Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned, Indigenous-delivered. And I think that that's a theme. It's not the right wording, it's not a theme. It's a reality of how we undertake our business, touching on Skye's earlier presentation in relation to the cultural aspect of mobility, and then Aaron talking about where he sits within his space as an Aboriginal man and working with his community. And then when Nat picked up understanding the needs of certain Aboriginal communities within New South Wales required for that. So I think when we bring it all together and with your overview of what's been occurring, I think the strongest theme to come out of that is exactly what you've said: Indigenous design, Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned, for us to be able to move forward within this space. And we're now I have to apologise. You can probably hear I'm a little bit sick, so there's been a few cold and flu tablets taken this morning, so I sincerely apologise if I'm a little bit all over the place. We're going to open it up to questions now. If anybody has any in the audience? Oh, we've got one down the front here. And I apologise if I miss you, it's just really bright lights.
Hi.
Oh, are we able to get it on the first slide with the presenters, please? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karen Adams from CARM's Aboriginal Corporation based in Bateman's Bay in Canberra. My question is to you, Nat, and it's really to all government agencies that make policies that not-for-profits like us have to navigate. For example, your $5 rent policy. Who fills the gap for that $5 amount to their rent that they were paying for people like us who get no government funding?
Well, I guess the rent is that revenue is within ourselves, so we cover that when the person who's in our tenants. It's not across the board. This is specifically for our tenants under our policies. So yeah, we've got multiple cohorts that are eligible for $5 rent for all different reasons. We've just identified that the cohort of people who are travelling due to mobility and needing to access medical services have got expenses associated with that and would put their tenancy at risk. So that's under our own roof, so we don't impose that on anybody else.
Okay, I should have prefaced that we've got AHO houses.
Yes.
And so we manage those. So
Right.
we have to abide by those same policies, but there's nobody filling the gap. And because all of our expenses and all of the expenses associated with that house come from the rent, at $5, we're already behind. So those policies that are, that we have to abide by, government policy, there's nowhere for us to go to get that money from a different government department while they experience domestic violence, in and out of prison, as you say, on sorry business. So when these policies are made at a government level, and then you're expecting houses that you've given to people like us to manage, there's no thought into who pays the people like us to maintain those tenancies for our tenants.
And I think that's something that I can probably take away and go and speak with the AHO about, because I think and I absolutely understand that there would be some policies that, I guess, used by both Aboriginal community housing providers and community housing providers and us as a tenancy landlord management landlord as well. But yeah, there are some that don't kind of, that stay under Homes New South Wales, but I would absolutely have a chat with the AHO and just bring that up as an issue that we need to talk through and have a look. So yeah, happy to take that away. And if I can get your details afterwards, I can reach out to you if you like.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks.
And can I just add to that? Like, that's not an issue limited to New South Wales. So that's an ongoing issue where I often bring up to government, in that government's happy to continue funding things at the cost of the public when it's delivered through their services, yet when it is transitioned out from government to community control, the expectation is that community control organisation has to be self-sustainable. We know that doesn't work. We know anyone delivering affordable housing is coming from a place of deficit, meaning the rent that you collect is never going to fully cover the full cost of doing business. We know that, government, community, in private industry. So what is the new model? What should the new model look like, where anyone delivering affordable housing services is entitled to some form of subsidy or to cover the costs of repairs and maintenance to provide a safe environment?
Thanks for that, Zach. And I think an important point was made there, obviously coming from an Aboriginal community housing provider myself. This is a very valid discussion on my behalf too, and covering very many different states. That's a really important point made by Zach, because I can assure you New South Wales is not the only state where there's an impact on that. It's across the board. And I think that's when it's time for government to start taking into account the severity of the sector, not just limiting it to the Aboriginal community housing sector, but the community housing sector as a whole, in what we're given and what we're expected to achieve in the long run through those programs that exist for government. Down the front.
Another one for you, Natalie. You touched on very briefly local decision-making structures and learning from those. I'm really curious to hear what those structures are and how they connect to statewide level policy.
So we haven't started on this piece of work yet, but what we're wanting to do is actually look at what are the local decision-making agreements, not just within New South Wales, but in the other states and territories. Particularly interested, I believe there was an evaluation done recently on local decision-making agreements in the Northern Territory. So we're just wanting to learn from that and understand that and see, is there potential for us to improve our policies and improve the way that we deliver services. So it's really a learning exercise at this point, and it's something that we're about to start doing, but we realise there are, there are already, I believe, local decision-making agreements in New South Wales, but yeah, definitely across those other states and territories, and how they would interact with us, where we've got different legislation, different policies, and a different landscape, social housing landscape as well.
Thanks for that. I just have a question for Skye. Hi, Skye. Given the announcement on the federal budget, with the injection of funds within the Northern Territory with focus on particular remote housing and a focus on new supply and to some degree refurbishment or repairs and maintenance model, based off of your presentation, speaking to mobility and taking in the cultural context and what that can look like, what is your thoughts as the CEO, as AHNT, but also as a Northern Territory girl, your thoughts on how that could look for the Territory in being able to take into the mobility context, but also the deliverable of new supply for the communities?
Thanks, Stacey. No, I think that's a really good question, and we've just entered into a partnership agreement for the 10 years of the $4 billion, and we think it's an opportune time where we want to be able to influence policy, to be able to embed Aboriginal voices, which is driven by our members, in how we want to see houses being delivered. They need to be culturally appropriate. Climate change is real. And it's about, I keep going back to the place-based, people-centred approach. We need to be doing real open discussions with communities and not think that a one-size-fits-all is what our people need. Picking the colour of your house shouldn't be the only decision you have. It's about genuinely listening and having to change, I think, is what we're finding. We're at the very early beginning of this change, and we want to embed that the way that things have been happening. We know there's the need is so huge, but it's about doing things properly and what is right for our people. And getting a home is key to it, but to sustain your tenancy, we need to be informed by the people that are living in the houses.
Thanks for that,
That
Skye.
answers it.
No, that was really good. Down the front.
Thank you. My name's Sandra Harbin and I'm Noongar from Perth, and I work at Noongar Maimaia, and I'm their cultural consultant, and I recently developed the Noongar Housing First Principles, which is based on Housing Principles Australia. And so, from my understanding, it's the first of its kind. So I'm really, really happy that I chose this session to come to, because as a Noongar, as an Aboriginal person, I get it. I get everything that all of the presenters said, and particularly Skye, what you said about mobility and the needs and rights of Aboriginal people. And so I made a couple of notes here, and and I'm not sure who can answer, but to me it sounded like a cultural centred approach. Everything that was talked about from all the presenters is about a cultural centred approach. And we hear things like people-centred approach and so on. But as a Noongar and coming from the Noongar Housing First Principles, I've really immersed myself in the cultural centred approach. And so, I still hear words like overcrowding, and I don't think we should be using that word anywhere. And I think until we start to use an alternative term, then people are still going to be using the word overcrowding. And so if we're talking about a cultural approach, then we should be talking about, because overcrowding isn't a cultural approach. Overcrowding is something that the Wadjulas or the white fellas use, to say there's too many people living in a property. And yet, if it's cultural, it's things like family groups or kinship groups, so that we get away from that negative connotation of overcrowding, which I think it's quite negative. It's taking away from the cultural right. So, anyway, I'm keen to hear what you say. And the other thing I wrote down was, that was probably the main one, was about overcrowding. And I think that we need to use terminology that's more, comes from a cultural language. Our rights as Aboriginal people, the rights of our mob to, access housing based on their laws, on their connection to their land, connection to their families, which then I think links in exactly what you were saying, Skye, about linking into that knowledge and that cultural connections about our language, our stories, from the land that the different groups come from. And if they're disconnected and being put into regional areas, then, we're just continuing the disconnection of Aboriginal people from culture since colonisation. So I think, it's a cultural right, and that's what my Noongar Housing First Principles is all about, is about the cultural rights through Noongar law, and because it don't change. Thank you.
So overcrowding for us in the NT is the form of homelessness. I can give you an example of a cousin of mine. She lives in Maningrida. She's still in the house that her mother was in. There's 5 generations in that house. There is no other options for them to move to another place. The reality is we have a housing crisis. We haven't invested in homelands, which a lot of our mob are connected to homelands, which will relieve the main centres. It's about governments making it easier, creating hub towns, putting our families at, I guess, that pressure of having to, there's nowhere to move. So our families are facing overcrowding, which is a form of hidden homelessness, where there are no other options unless they come into centres like Darwin and so forth. So we're in a crisis. We need to get more houses, and we keep pushing for homelands. We'll keep continuing pushing for homelands, investment into homelands, because that's going to be a form of relieving the housing crisis. The populations in homelands are continuing to grow, but there are no services for homelands. In our remote communities, there's no transport, there's no public transport to get you from A to B. If you want to be able to travel for a funeral, you have to catch a bush bus, which is going to take your whole payment to get to a funeral. Then you're stuck there for your cultural obligation to be in community, to support your family when it comes to sorry business. The cost of living, we talk about the cost of living in our main centres. You go to a remote community, you're paying 50 to 80% more for what we're paying in these main centres. So we've got our families living in remote communities, homelands. They're primarily living on welfare payments. It's a real struggle. So, it's not a good term, but it's a reality of it. Our houses are overcrowded, which is a form of homelessness. And we need to invest in remote communities, homelands. We constantly have the pushback in our urban centres. They don't want our mob in there. We'll start supporting our remote communities, start supporting our homelands so we can invest in people again, people-centred, place-based. I hope that answers your question.
So,
Aaron, do you want to add to that?
yeah, I'd also like, because there's two sides to this. I mean, I'm just thinking from housing here in Adelaide and overcrowding in the metro and also in the lands, and I agree with everything you're saying, because one thing that came out with all of my talking to community is they really feel the loss of all the homelands, because it's, in government's eyes, if we centralise everything into the, these 9 communities, then it's, and ultimately I reckon they would want just one big, super community. But the problem is the homelands were like a pressure release valve for some of these mobs. So if there's drama, because they'd always tell us, Armada, Ernabella, all of these places, they were white constructs that were, communities that were made, and it forced families to live together that never used to live together, just because that's where the services were. And then what would happen is, back in the day when they did have homelands, if there was a conflict in the community, this family could just uproot and then just go back to where their homeland, which might be, a few 50 k's or 100 k's away from community, but then they can actually escape and reset. And then once everything's passed, they all would generally come back. But with the, loss of funding to maintain these homelands, we're noticing a lot more, behaviours like which conflicts in communities and in family fighting, all of that. And I think so that's one thing they've definitely felt. And then I had another point, but now I can't remember. But here in Adelaide, I think, yesterday someone was mentioning, do we change I think the policy on what is overcrowding? Like, do we do two person per room? And I think that's sometimes a bit of semantics. I feel like you'll just end up changing the policy, but then it doesn't change what's going on. And I know a lot of people were worried about my team going, you're just, you're telling people they can't have family in their property. And I said, no. I say, I actually don't mind. I turn a blind eye to it sometimes. But the problem I have is that I can't report on everyone in that property, which I want to have that oversight. So then when I'm reporting and trying to seek best outcomes for them, I can know who's in that property. But as soon as I start adding all these people, it starts to ring alarm bells going, there's too many people in this property, which is an issue. But then I think the other thing that I have to do with, because I'm only going to speak about my people coming to Adelaide, so they're living off country, they're living on Kaurna country, and what they're used to on the lands is they're used to living amongst them, their kin and people like them. So playing church music at 2 a.m. in the morning is completely fine. And so I spend a lot of time just having that sort of we call it a cultural negotiation. We're going, okay, you're living in the city. I'm not going to say you can't have your family here, but you need to be understanding. as soon as those numbers start building up and the louder your voices get, my people don't know how to speak softly. So it always sounds like they're in conflict. And I try and work out, ways that they can still manage having all their family there so that they're not ostracising themselves from community. So we try and work out little, ways for them to deal with that. So sometimes they might be going to the parkland and just giving them a rest, or move across to another property and just, sort of spread them out. And it's not the best answer, but it's what I got to work with, because I have to deal with all the complaints that come in, and that's the hardest part. Is we could change the policy, say it's okay, and say it's not overcrowding anymore, it's just cultural living, but then I'm still going to receive all those complaints from the neighbours, and that's going to be very hard to defend without buy-in from the rest of the community and going and upskilling the public about how, Aboriginal people, how they live, and what we, that we're very spiritual. A lot of time the reason why we don't want to live alone is because we're scared of in their safety and numbers. We're worried about the mummels or the spirits that could come and get us, and so we have people with us. It's a safety thing. So yeah, I don't know if I answered. I kind of rambled a bit.
Thanks for that, Aaron and Skye. In the middle.
Hi, my name's Natalie Bradshaw. I'm from Legal Aid New South Wales. I was really interested, Aaron, when you were talking about your role. A couple of things. How many tenancies would you be looking after, so one person be looking after, to make that connection with tenants? And the other thing is part of your role, I think you kind of have hinted that part of your role is managing those tenancies in a different way. But I guess from a legal point of view, in the services we provide, other things that might come up, like rent arrears, or when you can't, when things escalate with those behaviours, how does your role fit into sustaining those tenancies and working with other services to sustain those tenancies when, if those, even for rent arrears, for example, because I think in New South Wales, especially with cost of living, we just find that we just get more and more matters around that, and that's a really difficult point, because ultimately you've got your landlord and those obligations as well.
Oh, I feel like I have so much to say. No, so how many tenancies we currently have? We had about up to 70 at the start of the year, and it's because we only specifically work with people from Central Desert region, and we were very specific, because what was happening when we first started, people were starting to, we were getting scope creep. People were starting to push us to, we've got an Aboriginal person here, an Aboriginal person there, and I knew what would happen if I didn't start to push back on that, as eventually would be spread so thin that we wouldn't be useful, or we wouldn't be able to do much. So that was difficult, and it was having a good manager who was able to also buy into what we were talking about and protect us at the initial stages. We're only a team of 2, and we're brought on to do something completely different. And I think I was just saying before, COVID was in a way good, because I think people were so busy trying to deal with that they were like, I said, I want to try this, and they're like, yep, go ahead, give it a shot. So it was actually a good time to, I guess, try things. And so what happened is, when it became our own region, we ended up getting 2 housing officers to manage those up to 70 tenancies. And basically the criteria was they had to be, language, English not their first language, come from a remote community, and they're currently living in Adelaide. So and even though it's only, right now I think we're up to about 60-ish or 50, high 50s. Sounds like small numbers, and I know our regular HOs, across the regions, might manage 300 properties, but I think that's a bit ridiculous, because I think it's quite difficult to build relationships and visit them once a year. So, but in saying that, in having even just 60 tenancies, each one of those tenancies has about, could have 5 to 10 people in it. So really we're dealing with hundreds of people displaced, either floating through those tenancies, sleeping, being extra people in that property. And I try and see it as a, I said, we're there to deal with the house, but then I've got my 2 tenancy practitioners or cultural workers, I try and call them, to go there and talk to the rest of the household, see what they, I guess, where they're at. Just ask them, hey, what's happening? You're visiting, like, what are you up to? Is there anything we can do? But we also try and give them the knowledge as well and go, okay, just be mindful that you may impact this tenancy, and these are the things that you can do to, I guess, avoid, that. So, because a lot of time, as we know, if I go there and tell the tenant, you got to tell these people to leave, they'll say yes to my face, and then I'll walk out, and then they won't say it. And so sometimes I'll even go there because I am related to a lot of them. I'll have a blunt conversation with them, and I have that right to, because I am connected to them. And there's different ways, because sometimes someone might be my big sibling, so I have to approach it from a sideways approach, which I can't be direct, otherwise they'll get cranky with me. Or I utilise one of my other workers to, who's got a better or a more appropriate relationship to work with that client. As for rent arrears, I don't know, like that one's always a tough one, because everyone, what I'd like to do, so our KPIs, I'm always trying to think of what is a good outcome, and what is a successful animal tenancy. That was the first question I was thinking. I didn't know what it was, so I thought we need to figure out first of all what is success according to our tenants, and I still haven't figured that out yet, but because I want to be able to bring them all together and ask them what would you like to, what would be success for you. As for rent, I found I want to be able to reduce their debt, and so we're asking them to throw in a little extra $5 here and there. We're trying to get other people in the household we're looking at all these different ideas. Can you contribute to the rent? Can you help out with the debt? Because those tenants get lumped with everything, and the debt, the service exclusion, the reports, everything. DCP would potentially might look at them because they've got kids in the household, but they're just stuck with this. They're the unlucky recipient that just get all the drama, and it's their name on the head tenancy. So we're trying to again look at other ideas on regular things they're asking for, which is skip bins. They're always wanting skip bins. So one thing I even spend time just talking about waste management. So, but at the same time, that's so difficult, because if you've got 20 people in your property at any time, the amount of waste that you collect is just, I have a house party, and my bins are full. That's for one night, so I'm imagining one of our tenancies having 10 to 20 people in it. That one blue or yellow bin, I don't know what colour it is in every state, but that's not going to manage. And so I've even gone to councils and asked them, could you give us 2 bins or 3 bins and take away the green bin, because I said it's all that's going to happen is that's going to get filled with rubbish. But then I've been told, no, we can't do that because we need to be seen to be encouraging recycling. And I said, okay, well, you're just going to have a bin full of rubbish now, and you're not going to be able to collect it. It's going to create waste, create potential for infestation from mice and other cockroaches, and now we've got a bigger problem. So I'm trying to push those things to change those policies. Just seems small, but I feel like it has bigger implications. Sorry, I don't know if I answered some of your question.
Yeah, no, it's really. Thank you. It's really interesting to, and your role is really interesting. So thank you very much.
And I think a couple of things to pick up from there as you were speaking, brother, were being First Nations, living and working in your community, the need for boundaries and understanding those boundaries, which is very difficult from a cultural obligation perspective. Barriers for services, something as simple as a bin from the local council. There's, we tend to take, I wouldn't say take it for granted, but, to be able to have access to a bin with the larger household. And also looking at, from the cultural mobility point of view, and touching on what Arnie said here, from that cultural understanding, taking into account that we have very significant cultural obligations, and we're all different. We're not all Aboriginal people are one and the same. Not all First Nations people, I should say, are one and the same. We all have our own different cultural practices throughout, but we also have that understanding of what our responsibility and our obligation is to our kin and our community. So I think there's some really key points in which you spoke to with that. And that leads, I can't see a hand, so I'm going to ask Zach a question, unless I'm not looking properly. I'll come back to you. Is that all right, babe? So that leads me to Zach, because I really liked his overall sum up of the national perspective. How do you think government, whether it's Commonwealth or state-based, and in particular, I suppose it's more of a Commonwealth question, given the driving force around housing at the moment with the Housing Australia's Future Fund and a couple of other things there, how do you think, or what do you think would be kind of a best practice approach to operationalise cultural mobility? And I know I've put you on the spot there, but you're pretty deadly, so I know you can get a response.
Thanks. That $50 I paid you earlier paid off. Look, I think we've been quite clear in NATSIHA around the existing systems and structures of how things are delivered is not working. You can chuck as much money as you want through a failing system, and you'd be silly to expect a different result. And that's just a reality of almost now 65 years of failed policies and failed systems that continue to not truly address the issues that we're all facing. So, I mean, the concept of an Indigenous-owned and led system, a new system, we have to look at things outside of the existing frameworks and structures. We need a completely new ecosystem where it's 100% Indigenous-led and owned, that has long-term secure funding, that isn't at the whim of a change of government, so that it has bipartisan support and is protected by legislation, and actually give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people a real shot at addressing the issues and challenges in their communities. Because as it stands, and there are things like, often when people report on funding that's been distributed nationally and in each state and territory, they talk about the dollars spent. But what we know is much of that money isn't in the hands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Most of that money is being eaten up into the systems and machineries of government. And not attacking people individually or agencies or governments individually, but it's just the fact that the current systems and structures don't work and has proven to not work. So I guess what the sector constantly comes up with is we want a new system where it's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander led and owned, there's secure long-term funding protected by all parties. So you're not going to fix this problem in a 1-year government term or a 2-year government term, but we need long-term secure funding led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be actually delivering what's required.
And what do you think the new system could capture? Or we haven't got that far yet. We're still in our thinking phase.
Well, we've certainly been advocating for a separate national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing and homelessness plan that would then bring in all governments to look at, and then but it be developed by community and then ratified through all levels of government. So certainly that's a conversation that NATSIHA has been quite open with in all of our advocacy. And that would then, I guess, allow to start those conversations, to start building those systems nationally, to bring in all governments, to have that ratified, to be protected through legislation, and then actually allow and give authority and agency to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to start developing things at a national level, things at a state level, things at a local level, so it's all consistently run and led through Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
So first step would be looking at a specialised First Nations housing plan, because we've never had one. I'm looking for Uncle Ivan. We've never had one, Unc? No? Beautiful. Just wanted to make sure I've got my oracle agreeing with me there. First step is to look at that, and then from then obviously proceed into how we can add in, from this perspective, the cultural rights to mobility, access to housing based off the United Nations principles and things along those lines.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasise on the fact that it needs to be a ground-up approach. So I guess NATSIHA is the vehicle nationally can partner with our state and territory peaks and leads, but equally that consultation needs to occur from community to feed up into what that national overview should look like. So I just want to make that clear. And since coming back from the UN, I don't use First Nations anymore. I spent a bit of time with the Australian leading constitutional lawyer, and he advised me that in an international context, First Nations cede sovereignty. So I don't use that term anymore, just to share that if no one knows.
Fair enough. Thanks for that, Zach. I'll take that on board too. Sorry, I don't mean to point out white shirt, but lady in the white shirt.
That's all right. I think you kind of preempted my question a little bit. I'm from the Department of Social Services, and I was just wondering what advice you have for people who work in all levels of government. This is to Zach, but really to anyone on the panel. What advice you have for people to, within their different levels of government, to advocate for giving over control to community organisations, like from the design process as well as just like asking people to run programs. What advice you might have for convincing people within systems, for people who are within systems to convince those around them that like we need to give up more control, or we need to give up more funding from like an early design part of the process.
Thanks, that's a great question. I think first and foremost, I often say, in my experience with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander affairs and through many sectors, not just housing, but I often, when I come to talk to people, people often talk about black affairs from a place of welfare immediately. So that mindset needs to change immediately. So we're actually in control of, I think, moving up to almost 50% of Australian landmass now. So like, we're not coming without nothing. We're actually an equal partner in this. And we're specialists in our own affairs. So in any other way of life, you'd be talking to whoever the specialist subject matter expert is. And in this case, it's us. So, in any other part of life, you'd be listening. You wouldn't be going to, you wouldn't be talking to a florist about your issues for your health, right? So in our, I guess, affairs, we are the specialists and we are giving you that advice. We are obviously trying to build on all of the mainstream ways of doing business, so trying to get the right research from a mainstream perspective to support the positions and the practical steps forward that we know will work. But I think it is hard when you're working under the constraints of an existing system that's failing. And all we ask is to be an equal partner in this, to advocate for that change. So, across all levels of government, we're having these conversations. And I think it's just a conversation that continues to need to have. But the first step is, I think, changing the mindset of, there's actually First Nations examples of excellence all around the country that already exist, that have been running for a long time. And if we look at other sectors like health, the concept of how things were designed has actually filtered over to mainstream services. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, the holistic model of care, was birthed from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. And that's now been adopted all across. Equally for housing, we're looking at it from a holistic perspective. We're looking at it from an in-partnership perspective with our communities to build sustainable industries long term. And I think if I can just ask, first and foremost, stop thinking of us from a welfare perspective, and then actually just come as an equal partner and an open mind to actually look at what the practicalities of what we're trying to achieve is.
That really resonates with me as well. My mother, she's white Australian. She went and moved up to the lands, in the APY lands, in 1969 as one of the first state teachers there, which is where she, met my father. And I remember one of the things she said, Aaron, like, your people used to, the men would travel out, they'd do all the work, they'd go mines for gems, they'd fashion them into items and sell them locally in at Alice Springs, and and the women were industrious out there collecting food, doing things and she said I could see them all, they were living like that. When it all changed was when she said it was welfare. She said as soon as they felt like there was sort of sit down money, it kind of killed that work drive that they had, and and she said it was very noticeable. She saw it like it just created the expectation that you just get something for nothing. And so one thing that when I think of how do I convince people, I'm thinking how do you influence people and get them to go, let's try something else, is I look at it as going, is this paternalistic? Is this creating dependency on this service or me or a person for that client, for that Aboriginal person? I like to think if at any point it means that they're going to rely on this service to get to for future, for the years and years, then we need to think of another way. So I'm always thinking when I'm trying to think of plans or my approaches, is this creating dependency? And I think that's served me well in convincing people to, I guess, move away from that sort of welfare sort of mindset.
I think also just summing that up too, thank you for that, Zach and Aaron. I think the welfare mindset is not just, it's nationwide within Australia. So it's not just limited to us as Aboriginal people thinking that way about ourselves, and I can assure you the vast majority of us do not think that way about ourselves, because we obviously know our journey, and we know our culture and who we are as people. But I think that what also contributes to that, based on what you're talking, is the stereotypical views that exist. I don't know if any other of my brothers, sisters, aunties and uncles in the room here and on the panel have heard, but I hear it all the time in, you mob get everything for free. You get everything for nothing, you get everything for free. And my response back to that always is, can I have the phone number? Can you tell me where to sign up? Because I would love that. I've got a mortgage in Sydney, and I'd love to not have to pay a mortgage payment every fortnight. That would be great. But that was being said to me personally when I remember being in year six primary school. It was said to me by a fellow student, because that was the perception that their family had. And now I'm 42, and it's still consistently run up that storyline there. So it comes back to what Zach was saying around, don't think of us in a welfare state mentality, because we're not, and we don't come from that. We come from the oldest living continuous culture in the world. Think of us from that state. We come from the oldest living continuous culture in the world. Australia's the only country that has that. No other country has that. So think of us in that state, and then modernise your thinking into, well, how do they adapt their culture into the modern world for them? And again, it feeds back into cultural mobility, the right to it. So I just wanted to sum that up. I get a little bit passionate with those things. I just wanted to sum that up. Sorry, Auntie, you've got a question at the front.
Yeah. Which I didn't want to comment on that. I wanted to ask something else. But, you're saying we're from the oldest continuous living cultures in the world. But given our history, we were excluded from society in every way, employment, education, housing, you name it. And so that welfare mentality, was certainly put upon us, by the settlers. But anyway, Zach, you're talking about Aboriginal-owned, Aboriginal-led approach and Aboriginal delivered. Now, I'm not actually in the service delivery, so you would have much more knowledge than me, and I hope I'm asking the right sort of question or saying the right context. But my understanding was, so I don't know whether it was nationwide or just in WA, but a lot of the Aboriginal organisations that, when the funding was around, you had to tender and bid for all these different funding, and a lot of the Aboriginal organisations missed out because, I don't know why, but a lot of the non-Aboriginal organisations won all the tenders for service delivery for Aboriginal people. So you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, or let me know what it was. And two, I talk to people in the housing industry, and given that Aboriginal people are the highest percentage of homelessness, and yet it hasn't reduced, homelessness numbers hasn't reduced. So is that why you suggest it's Aboriginal-led by Aboriginal people? Because the people that I've spoken to say, oh, look, we really need some cultural competency and we're not sure how to do it, and, we're learning. And I'm thinking, wow, yet you got all this money to look after homelessness and housing, and your highest number of clients are Aboriginal, and yet you haven't made a difference. I don't know, I could be wrong, but I'd love to hear your perspective on all of that. And Aaron's, if you have one as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And yes, I'm not in direct service delivery, but I'm happy to talk to part of that issue, because it is a national problem in terms of how procurements are run and how tenders are run, and the lack of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participation through all those tenders. And an example of that is the recent HAF tender that we know there's been limited to no Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander uptake in that process in terms of successful applications. So I think
we walked away from the process.
Yeah, and look, I think
Not
in that
limited to
case,
success.
in a lot of cases, Aboriginal and Torres Strait organisations and people in every industry are giving expert advice on what should work and what should be considered into legislation, what should be considered into procurement processes, what needs to happen to change what's occurring and what has historically occurred. Unfortunately, in majority of cases, that advice isn't being listened to. So then you've got an investment mandate signed off that's been delivered that isn't right across different industries, or you've got a procurement process that is run that hasn't factored in the advice of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as to making sure people are accessing those funds. So I think that goes back to, we've got decades. When I say 65 years, it's a broad context of the 1967 referendum to now. So from when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were given the vote to write and were recognised as people, from then to now, you've got decades of systemic failures and policy failures that haven't worked. So why continue down a pathway that continues not to work? We need something new. So that's why I'm saying an Indigenous-led, an Indigenous-owned, an Indigenous-managed system.
Yeah, I agree, because as I said, I've talked to different people who's in the housing, and they don't seem to make a difference in reducing homelessness. Well, that's my understanding anyway. So, yeah, it'd be great for the Aboriginal organisations, to get the funding and design and develop housing programs for our mob, our way, and culturally as well. Because I don't think that's... See, I've done some training with different organisations, so I get to hear like how they operate and so on, and how they gather cultural information. So they look at housing and homelessness through a cultural lens. And so if you can't do that, then I think it's hard to actually make a difference if you don't have that knowledge. And so I even think that there should be some sort of accreditation or training, through the TAFEs and that, to do, certificates in cultural competency in housing and homelessness. Anyway, thank you.
I was going to say, just to be a little bit, I don't know, because I've had the time to think about a lot of this stuff, and sometimes I even have the devil advocate sort of mindset where I look at things from the other way, which is just speaking very specifically about the group I work with, to homelessness, or living out in the parklands. I'm just going to use that as an example. Sometimes I've had people I've been there when the homelessness service has been there, and I can hear them speaking a language, and they basically don't want to be, they just want to be left alone. And so I feel like, is every single person in the parkland wanting a house? Because if in doing so I'm actually locking them into a lease that they, I'm confident will have a feeling they're not going to be able to meet the demands of it. Are they going to be able to, they're going to potentially end up in debt. In a 6 months' time, they're going to be, again, back on and excluded from the service. I feel like I'm actually putting them at more risk. And so, and I know that sometimes goes against the thinking that people go, we've got to get people in houses and that'll fix everything. Sometimes I think it causes more trouble. And so I just want to ask the questions before they go into the house. I want to meet with them. I want to let them know that the expectations are actually, in order for you to have this house, this is the minimum of what is expected of you. And I want to be honest, just to avoid them from being disadvantaged later on, or just, because I see their account numbers and I see the negatives and I'm just like, man, there's so much debt. And the other thing is culturally, they can't have fires at their house. Whereas in the parkland, they can have a fire and they can have 20 people sitting around and they get left alone. Whereas if I put them on a lease, they're going to go into the house and they're straight away going to get in trouble for having those gatherings there. And so I feel, you know, so is it, you know, I start to think maybe the other idea is don't put them in a house that's suitable, that allows them to have that social thing without being in the parkland. Is it a, you know, is it a dormitory style living arrangement? You know, it's about the materials that property is made out of. I always like to think of if there was a way to shelter them, so then they could have the fireplace in the middle amongst houses, you know, design it with them in mind. That could be a way forward. I don't know, these are just the sort of things I think about. I don't know if it's an answer to your question, but it's just thoughts.
Yeah, I do, and I love hearing what you're saying, because they're exactly the things that I think about, and you know, and and you're absolutely right. Not everyone wants a house. They just might want to be with their mob out in the park, you know, and be left alone. And I know that happens as well. So I take on board that. But probably about 25 years ago, when I was working for government, I was in policy, and one of the things was a lot of the Noongars would ring me because I was in research and they knew me, and they'd say, you know, we want to have a fire, but we can't have a fire, and you know, they've given us gas and we don't want a gas. We want a so, you know, the pot bellies and so on. So I used to get this all the time, and so when I got into policy, I was still getting that same question. So I thought, well, let me have a look at the government policy on, you know, on these pot bellies. And anyway, the policy was it was only for returned soldiers, you know, for the veterans. And I thought, oh, hang on. So I looked at it from a cultural perspective and wrote up a paper to the executive and said, you know, culturally, Aboriginal people need to have fire for spiritual, cultural, you know, healing and so on. And so they changed the policy. And it was probably because they didn't know, see, they were culturally incompetent, so to speak. And so got the policy change where all the Noongars who, you know, were down south wanted pot bellies so they could light their fire and have it inside. And they're all saying, thank you so much. So, yeah, I get what you're saying for sure. Thank you.
And I think I'm just very conscious that we've got a couple of minutes left of the session, and I think that's a great way to end it. And the reason being is if you were to unpack some of what Auntie's just said and what Aaron said and Skye said and Nat said and Zach has said today, it comes back to what I think a very clear message that's coming through this session today in relation to the cultural right to mobility is Indigenous design, Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned, which is clear principles around self-determination as well. So I would like to thank the panel today. I'd like to thank Skye, Zach, Nat and Aaron for giving their time up today and sharing with us. And if you would like to stalk them / want to know where they're at, use your little Duvilaki thing, what are they called? QR codes. And you'll be able to find all their profiles through that to be able to get in contact with them afterwards or at lunchtime, whatever works for you guys. Thank you so much for your time today, everybody.